Welcome back, everybody, to Go Local Live. It is Business Monday. We are pleased to have a guest back with us, Skyping in from New York City, not Haiti this time, is Deacon Moynihan, head of the Haitian Project, the educational organization that's been educating folks in Haiti at a very high level for the past couple decades. He made national news when he refused a donation from NFL owner Bob Kraft for moral reasons, that Mr. Kraft had been tied to an arrest relating to the use of prostitutes. Deacon Moynihan, thanks for coming back on.
Well, thank you for having me. I do want to just not contradict the interviewer right off, but I do want to point out that it's not actually on moral reasons, it's on social reasons. Human beings are social beings, and we require society to fully manifest ourselves. And the issue of prostitution is not a personal issue. It is actually a public health and safety issue. It's a health issue because of the transmission of communicable diseases, which are very serious and proven to be very detrimental to society. It's also an issue because in and around illegal activity, no matter what the illegal activity is, it's a creation of money. Money creates laundering needs. Laundering needs create protection needs. And so, you can't just isolate this and say, oh, this particular activity, this illegal activity happening in Florida in 4 different counties, very entrenched, is something as simple as a moral issue. I know I'm a deacon and it seems like I'm pointing fingers. Not at all. We're all sinners, and I'm not judging Mr. Kraft at all in terms of his personal actions. We're looking specifically at what does it mean when a guy unrelentlessly and myopically pursues the protection of his reputation and avails himself to the best legal talent he can get without regard to what does that mean to the 4 counties that were simply trying to eradicate prostitution.
In the last 2 weeks, I think you were on 2 weeks ago, a number of things have taken place. First of all, his legal team seems to have fought off the efforts by the prosecutors to release the video.
Right.
Allegedly showing him in a illegal sex act, and that in the prosecutor's argument that that's standard that such evidence as that is released, that it's in the public interest. Those attorneys have been able, for Mr. Kraft, have been able to beat back that argument by prosecutors and have gotten at least one judge to hold those tapes from being released. What's your thought about their very extraordinary effort to make sure that those tapes weren't released?
Well, you can't blame somebody for wanting to fight to win, but It is interesting that his dream team actually stated that they were in the fight to win and that they weren't going to give up until they got what they wanted. And there's been a number of articles that have come out, one by Matt Ford, suggesting that if you have enough money, you can make the legal system behave itself. And the issue that I'm having is way too much questioning of the local police force and the sheriffs and their actions have been brought into the picture here. Because yes, they bungled it. There's no doubt that they would all like to have installed a camera that simply could be turned on and off, so that they could have discreetly, without interrupting their surveillance, turn off the camera when it was obvious that the activity was legal and turn it on when the activity would have been perceived as being illegal. And the issue then became that their tape becomes inadmissible, not because it's illegal to tape people doing illegal acts, but because, unfortunately, due to just a lack of technical ability, they ended up filming people that were involved in acts that are not illegal, that were simply getting massages.
Right.
And so they've won this round. But, it's interesting, the press calling that a monumental victory, it really is a failure for society, right? Because I really believe these police departments didn't have any interest in whether or not Mr. Kraft keeps a football team or not, or what Goodell has to do ultimately. Their interest is in eradicating an extremely commercialized, extremely, pervasive ring of prostitution. And I happen to live in one of those counties, and I don't want there to be prostitution next to a Subway and a strip mall. And I don't think anybody does.
Do you think that the release of the tape is in the public interest, that it would have a benefit, being more than just salacious, that it would have the benefit of diminishing future acts that impact the sex trade in Florida?
Absolutely not. I don't think the tape needs to be released. I've said that before on to Mutt and Callahan, which, I'm not sure what they understand or don't understand. They're not exactly proving to me that they have tremendous sense of character. But I think I said to him, I do not believe the tape needs to be seen by the general public. It could have been seen by the jury, the lawyers, the judge, to make sure that, that it's been handled properly. The fact that it's inadmissible makes complete sense. It's just unfortunate. Nobody intended to bungle this situation. They have. But to have the lawyers sort of gloat over it is very interesting. There's an article by Mark Freeman that was written for what I think would have to be at least the second largest newspaper. Miami Herald probably might be larger, I'm not sure, but it's the other large Florida newspaper. And this article is almost 2,000 words long. And in this article, there is no representation of independent lawyers, who are experts. There is no representation of the prosecutor's side in any new way. Throughout, the lawyers that are quoted are three sets of lawyers. A lawyer who is currently involved in launching a class action suit against the counties for the fact that they filmed people that went there for massages. Then Mr. Kraft's main team is in it, all right? And then, of course, Jack Goldberger, who I feel is especially a problematic individual in this case because of what he's done through his legal work with Jeffrey Epstein in the Epstein debacle. So throughout this thing, these people are quoted. It's interesting. One of the quotes is from Burke, one of the lawyers that represents Mr. Kraft, and he basically quotes and says that that Ehrenberg, the Attorney General, State Attorney General, that's at the top of this thing, he basically says, well, Ehrenberg admits that there's no case without the film. That I don't think is actually true, and the fact that the defense lawyer got to characterize and nuance what the defense lawyer, what the prosecuting attorney is doing, is just outrageous. I mean, right. Why can you write an article with no real questions about who these rings are, who's operating? It's all just about how now the tape's inadmissible and Kraft has won and what a great victory this is. I would like to see a little bit of a different treatment of the situation that focuses more on the actual issue of prostitution.
We're at month, I'm going to guess, 2 that this has been in the public sphere, maybe a little more than 2 months. What's the proper conclusion to this in your mind? Mr. Kraft's reputation has obviously been questioned. He still faces some potential discipline from the NFL and his fellow owners. Lots of speculation as to what that might mean. He's been embarrassed by his own behavior, and to some degree, when folks like yourself say, "I don't want his money," that's got to be a little embarrassing. What's the solution to this? What's the proper remedy?
I think the proper remedy is for there to be a clear denouncement of prostitution and the impact that prostitution has on society as a health risk. And as I said, creating criminal activity always creates with it real issues. What I would like to see happen here is, rather than spending all this time on whether or not Mr. Kraft has found a way to technically evade what he allegedly did in a manner that will allow Goodell to technically evade making any actions, that's not the purpose of the 4-county attempt to eradicate prostitution. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to see journalists spend a lot more time talking about why aren't the 2 women that were originally arrested in this situation, why aren't they talking? It's quite normal to offer plea deals or other things to get women in that situation, or men, or anybody running a prostitution ring or involvement, to make some sort of statement. So that's a really intriguing question. It's like, why aren't they willing to talk at all in this case? Why are they taking the fifth? I mean, how is it that in this incident, think about this. On one hand, you got Mr. Kraft gets rolled up in this. That's pretty abnormal, right?
Right.
He's not everyday person in the United States. And at the same time, they seem to have arrested the two G. Gordon Liddies of prostitution running, who refuse to participate in any way in clearing up what they were doing. Somebody needs to ask. I'd like to see 2,000 words written on who these two women are and what their connection is to the whole issue of prostitution in those 4 counties. That's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see the focus shift to, you can simply pull up the CDC. Just go to the CDC and ask the CDC what are the negative impacts of prostitution. And it's amazing what they'll list.
You're saying the Center for Disease Control, what the implications are from the sex industry, and what its implications are not only to sex workers, but to their families and to others.
Right. And so, that's where I'd like to see the focus to go, because what's being missed here is this isn't about whether or not Mr. Kraft, who allegedly involved in these activities, is going to end up paying a fine and getting a misdemeanor. This is about whether or not we as a country want to recognize that good civil servants, unfortunately, making a large mistake in their actions in terms of the admissibility of a piece of their evidence. That's unfortunate. But they were trying to eradicate entrenched, commercialized prostitution ring that we're told had women going from room to room providing sort of an assembly line of sex acts.
Is there
so
something
dehumanizing.
Is there something in the water in Florida, though? And I'm not saying that this is isolated. The other day a couple weeks ago, we had a viral video about a man driving down the street, standing on the front hood of a car, holding onto a couch, going 20 or 30 miles an hour. And literally people said, that video can't be from here. It must be from Florida. Those were some of the comments. The video got watched about 100,000 times. Is there anything different about Florida that's unique to this situation, or could this be any strip mall anywhere in the United States that influential or non-influential people go for sex workers?
Well, I have to say that Florida was nice enough to accept me as a member of the state about a year ago or so when I moved, almost 2 years ago now, I suppose, when I moved there. And so, I appreciate that they let me in. I don't think there's anything particular about Florida. And I do think we should pay attention to the fact that of the 300 men arrested, not a few are actually from up here, so to speak, from New England. And so I really think it's not Florida, but when a place becomes abused, working in Haiti, as I said, one of the things that really made it difficult to accept the way that the minimization that's going on of prostitution, right? So you have Matt Ford now inventing a term, consensual sex work.
Right.
Is there a such thing? An illegal act that's entered into by somebody who is of a far less economic situation than the person securing those services in a power relationship. Is there such thing as consensual sex work? I argue that there's not. That in actuality, that is just a misnomer. It is a contradiction in terms. But Matt Ford introduced that into his article about the situation. Like I said, then you have Mark Freeman's article, which talks about the issue as if to totally ignore the real nature of prostitution. So if Florida is a great place, but they should be complaining to the rest of the world, because you know what makes prostitution? Let me ask you this. You're probably going to get this right off the bat. What do you think makes prostitution work?
From an economic standpoint?
What fuels it?
Men looking for sex.
The people who pay for it.
Right.
Largely men. It could involve women. I'm not going to be that gender specific. But it's the people that pay for it.
Right.
So that's what's wrong with what Mr. Kraft might have done. His allegedly involvement, if indeed he went there purposefully to carry out purchasing of sex, which is what is allegedly stated, right, and seems to be what the place was involved in, there's no disputing that, right?
Right.
It is the people buying the product that are keeping the product on the shelf.
Have you heard anything from the greater Kraft enterprise world, his attorneys, or any other agent of Bob Kraft since you went public with your announcement that you would not accept the donation?
Absolutely not.
Not a word.
We tried again to reach out in Wednesday after the article came out on Sunday to re-propose the idea of simply having him denounce prostitution. I mean, the CDC, everybody can tell you that prostitution is extremely antisocial, very bad for society. It leads to depression. It leads to people being sick with very serious illnesses, which often lead to death. It leads to people taking their own lives because they feel dejected. It's not a good thing, right? And so, one would hope that Mr. Kraft would take that into consideration and say, I need to denounce this activity, right? I need to denounce that. And then work towards making it clear that he doesn't think that every lawyer should be on everybody's team, because Jack Goldberger has a very specific thing to answer to. Now, I've been told by 1,000 people, one way or the other, let's say, not 1,000, but let's say a lot, that everybody has a right to own defense. I agree with that. And everybody has a right to hire the lawyer that helps them the most. But, you're from Providence. Is it true that the mafia once was entrenched in Providence? Is that
I believe so. We ran 10,000 pages of FBI files of Raymond Patriarca's FBI dossier.
And didn't Mr. Patriarca have different lawyers at different times for different activities?
Absolutely, many, and some quite prominent.
Did any lawyer ever get labeled as a mob lawyer versus another lawyer that might have been like the father of a future politician in Rhode Island, and he was known as his civic lawyer or his business lawyer? Or am I making that up?
I believe that certain names got associated with certain people in certain roles, and also great nicknames, Buckles and all sorts of creative names.
So what I'm suggesting here is that when Mr. Kraft availed himself to Jack Goldberger's assistance, he muddied the water hugely, because it makes it look like he is a very callous individual. Because Mr. Goldberger was part of a plea deal that resulted in a predatory pedophile only serving 13 months. And for the last 2 weeks, I've been vilified as a member of the Catholic Church and reminded how terribly, and I apologize again, as myself, as a member of the church that works in the church, on behalf of the hierarchy, we did not do our work in the past decades to protect people. And there have been rightful suits and payments to people who have been harmed. And I am not diminishing that at all by saying that I would never avail myself to the assistance of somebody like Jack Goldberger. Because the fact is, what he did, regardless of his conscience or his ethics, is a question. Why would you sit in the room with somebody that you know is going to walk in a manner that baffles the mind? Today, that's called the worst plea deal in the history of the United States. And what's interesting is press often report the activities of the Dream Team that Mr. Kraft is associated with, and it's very interesting how they'll say these lawyers, they'll name Shapiro, they'll name Burke, but Goldberger very rarely gets named. Single lawyer, they'll say lawyers on behalf of Kraft filed a motion to suppress forever the tape, which I agree with. The tape does not be seen by the public, but it was not lawyers that did that. The single signature lawyer on that motion is Jack Goldberger. We can get judged by our friends, and that to me is a major issue in this case. Why Mr. Kraft was advised to append him to his team, when in actuality it turned out to be a rather easy win in many ways. I mean, the judge did not have any trouble seeing the fact that the warrant was warranted, that the warrant was good, but the execution was bad. Hanser didn't seem to need a lot of help to see that. So
let's shift a little bit. One of the reasons why I wanted to have you back, obviously, this situation has been very provocative for lots of people to contemplate all the different issues. But the other thing is you've spoken out a number of times over the years on an issue that doesn't get very much attention, which is the gig economy, the so-called part-time contractor structure that is now permeating the workforce both in the United States and around the world. And specifically, you've spoken out very explicitly about Uber. And
yes,
I was wondering if you could kind of educate the viewer and outline what your issues are with Uber as a business model.
Well, in a nutshell, Uber wasn't innovative. It just, as has been reported in a New York Times article, but I said it a couple of years ago in an op-ed piece and wrote about it even before then in different ways, that the innovation of Uber was to shift the overhead onto the driver. And basically drivers have now figured that out, that in the end, when they actually calc the depreciation or the loss in value of their vehicle over time, the depreciation,
right,
that they're making, they pay their repairs and all of that, they make less than minimum wage. And I most recently wrote about that in the Providence Journal until 2017, based on some research that was done by a couple people at Harvard that included Professor Hazeltine, emeritus. It's appalling to me that a tech company got away with not providing drivers with something as simple as like a quicken calculator. Like, well, here's your car, here's its value today, here's its value in the future, here's your cost of operation. Do you want to be an Uber driver? No, they left them on their own. And what really bothers me is that the word entrepreneur gets used all the time to create labor abuses. And so, it's a classic case of three things with Uber. One, they did not properly inform the drivers, which they hired, did not hire, but contracted.
Right.
Two, they actually started their company in a manner that you weren't able to tip the drivers through the app, which was a clear red flag, right?
Right.
And then they just went around and willy-nilly, with total disregard for rule of law, deregulated an industry without anybody's formal permission.
Right.
And so they basically did the same thing. And I know this is going to sound bombastic, but what they did was the same thing that drug dealers do when they push fentanyl and Oxycontin, right? They basically are selling a product in a deregulated format. Now, obviously, Ubers aren't going to kill us as fast as those other things. So in terms of magnitude, it's not even close in its severity of impact. But just think about that. They basically deformalized an industry out from under itself. And they got away with it because they could give subsidies to the riders.
Do you think the success of Uber, maybe their IPO is not as overwhelming as some on Wall Street had anticipated, but there's a whole slew of new millionaires and probably a few new billionaires off the IPO of Uber. None of them are Uber drivers, I'll guarantee you that. That is absolutely true. Is this model of leveraging contract structures, the implications of it, and how this will spread and is already spreading against a wide collection of other applications to other industries. From your standpoint, when you flagged this 5 years ago, when Uber first came forward, where do you see this going, and what's the danger to society as we know it? I think there's a real problem in an anti-labor movement that is created by accident, maybe inadvertently. I don't know if the guys who started Uber actually had any. Young people today have very little understanding of the concept of utilities, labor unions. These things are vestiges of the past. Right. They're going to have to come back. I mean, labor unions are going to have to reassert themselves. And I see that what will happen within Uber is the same thing happened with Walmart, that there will become an organization or an organizing movement. But I don't think they'll end up being profitable at that point. They didn't really bring any innovation to the market. So if they lose the race to driverless cars, which they're not going to get to, from my opinion, I mean, this is my opinion, right, then they will not survive a drivers as asking to be fairly paid for their work. Because if they could survive that, they would be medallion taxi companies in New York. So they didn't bring any innovation to the field. They simply found a group of people that were willing to unwittingly submit themselves or put themselves into a situation was extremely uneconomic for them. You know what's really bad with Uber, though? Let me explain this to you. This is what really gets me going in the morning. Think about this. A young man goes out drinking, and he's responsible enough not to drive drinking, which is a good thing, right? So we support that. But he's also cheap enough not to take a taxi, and he can't get his friend to drive him, so he calls an Uber. And he gets a ride for almost nothing.
and then throws up in the guy's cab, and the cab ends up not being able to be used for a whole day, so that guy loses his shirt. He goes in his house, goes to bed, doesn't even think about it. He never asks himself, how did I get that cheap ride? Well, his grandmother's pension, which is managed by BlackRock, invested in a company that has been using the money that's been given to it as an investment to subsidize his taxi ride.
Right.
Now, that is what really bothers me about Uber, is the fact that, while that might be exaggerated a bit, but you actually could track the money that way.
So let me what stood out in your critique, which was different. I don't know if you know Saul Kaplan from Business Innovation Factory. He's a great champion of new business models and speaks loudly and proudly about whether it's Uber or scooters or all these different innovations in transportation. The other group that I've seen, obviously, who have criticized the Uber model, juxtaposed to Saul Kaplan, is Wall Street folks who say, listen, it's never made any money. We don't see it making money. It's constantly consuming cash to be able to sustain itself and grow, even with its manipulation of drivers. But we haven't seen much discussion by anyone, from Bernie Sanders to AOC or anybody else on the far progressive left, criticizing it from a worker standpoint. I don't hear progressives calling for unionization of Uber drivers. If I have, I've missed it.
I think that there's a possibility that there might be a complicity issue, and I don't think it's purposeful. But Bernie and AOC are both supported by a lot of young people who are relying on these on Ubers right now.
Yeah.
And so you wonder if they're just not looking at it because their staff loves Uber, because again they're getting a subsidized ride. So in that case, there's an issue, but there's absolutely, it's been identified over and over again. The reason why I could see the problem for the labor was because in Haiti we have these things called tap-taps, which are pickup trucks where you put a colorful canopy on the back and everybody sits on a bench facing each other riding down the road.
Yeah.
And I used to, when I was riding on them, I would think to myself, how can this thing pan out? I mean, how can you take this vehicle worth $3,000 or $4,000, $5,000, it's getting beat to heck on the roads, and people are paying literally, to them, it's significant amounts of money compared to what they're earning each day, but relative to the world economy, it's nothing. It's literally pennies for these rides, 15 cents, very little money. I was like, how does this calc out? And then I realized that a large portion of the tap-taps are sent to Haiti by cousins trying to help out brothers, sisters, cousins, whatever, cousins germain as we say in Haiti, friends, whatever, and they just basically drive the car into the ground.
Yeah.
So they could have sold the car for $3,000 and probably made 80% of what they were going to make, but they added an extra 20%. But if they take their earnings and try to buy another vehicle, it was never going to count. They just need another one given to them. And when I saw that and came to the United States and saw, the illegal deformalization of potentially a over-regulated industry, but certainly not one that doesn't deserve regulation, the taxi industry, you saw, wow, they're just taking formal sector activity and turning it into informal sector activity. And this is something that's killing Haiti. And these aren't entrepreneurs, these are abused laborers. And then I started to do the calculations and think about this. I'd hear my daughter say, oh, I went on an Uber ride, it took 22 minutes and I paid $10 or $12. Like, that's not possible, right? You know what somebody has to earn an hour to live in New York, right? So you can multiply 4 times 12, right, and get 48, and then you could subtract the amount of depreciation, costs, and gasoline, right? And you could realize that this guy isn't making a living, but you rode in this taxi. You wonderful. My daughter is so much more kinder and better person than I am. Her name is Michaela. Very great progressive, a wonderful feminist, a wonderful woman. But she rides in an Uber, and I'm like, I'd throw up in an Uber and clean it up myself because I wouldn't want to leave the driver with that problem. But I would never ride in an Uber because it would make me sick, because there's no way that you don't know you're abusing the labor if you understand economics. So I don't know why they haven't come to this, but contracting people is an inappropriate way of employing large groups of people. It goes around taxes, it goes around providing health care and other issues, other necessary benefits. To me, contracting labor is a way to destroy society, not to innovate it.
Do you foresee, via your words or others, that society relooks at this, especially in the United States?
The good news is society won't have to relook at it. The market, as much as I sound like, a socialist in this conversation, I mean, I believe in communalism. I believe us working as a community. I don't believe in socialism. I don't believe in any despotic, organized form of government that would organize us in a way to take away people's free will and otherwise. So I believe in capitalism. I mean, I was a trader. I love trading.
Right.
Capitalism is great. What's going to happen to Uber is going to be taken out by its own, live by the sword, die by the sword. Sooner or later, someone's going to realize there's no innovation in this company. And sooner or later, the drivers, it's already happening. I can relate to you an anecdotal case of this. My older brother and I were at a dinner and I understand now why my daughter likes Uber, because if you're trying to get a taxi from Brooklyn back to Manhattan, it's very difficult.
Right.
My older Mike, and we were at the Barclays Center, and after we finally stopped having a nice chat with one another, we read the sign that said there would be no more subways till the next morning. So we're like, well, that's it. We're not figuring out a new way home. We'll just go up and get a taxi. We walked to the curb, plenty of taxis there, and I said to the guy, hey, we want to go to West 4th. I stay at a house that belongs to the Scalabrinis on West 4th. I said, I need to go to West 4th, right where the subway station is at West 4th. And the guy said, yeah, I know where you go, $30. And I said to him, no, how about you put it on the meter and we see? It's like a $16 trip.
Yeah.
So these guys, I'm slowly hearing young people talk about that they can see the price going up on Uber. Uber's going to get closer and closer to regular prices because the subsidy's running out. Because when you're running a company that is actually IPO'd, they're going to look at those profits every quarter. And you can't just give them grandma's money anymore. The investors can't just roll in, And so where I see a democratic movement in this country needing to occur is I'd like to see a lot less orphaned retirement funds. And what I mean by orphaned is you have 4 or 5 firms handling 1 GDP of investment, orphaned into, mutual funds. I don't know about the stock market, and believe me, I don't know. So let's put it into Fidelity. Let's put it into Vanguard. Then a small group of people decide that Tesla continues and Ford struggles.
Right.
A small group of people decide that kids in Brooklyn are going to get subsidized taxi rides off of investments. I would like to see a democratization. I would like to see funds held from state pension funds invested in utility bonds, not in something else. I would like to see a change in how investment works in this country, because I believe that we're seeing the end of the efficiency of the current system, and it's time to get back to a much more diversified, much more open and democratic, in a sense, system. And so that's what I really believe, and that's why I'm constantly picking on Uber, because it's the classic case of investment gone awry, in my mind.
Deacon Moynihan, true great issues. Appreciate all your insights. I want to thank you for taking, almost 45 minutes with us while you're in New York. Hopefully we can have you back and wildly insightful on very complex issues, and appreciate you taking all the time.
Absolutely. If I could just ask your listeners and viewers to take a look at Mark Freeman's article, which is, was printed a couple of days ago in the Sun Sentinel. I would like them just to look at it. It ends with a paragraph which says, and this is by a lawyer representing a dozen of the men who were arrested for soliciting prostitution. So he says, the rule of law ultimately prevailed, which is great, but at the cost for all these people and their families. Kibbe, the lawyer, said, it should have never happened in the first place. If you parse the last paragraph of this article, what you find out is, yes, we want the rule of law to continue. There's nobody that believes more in the rule of law than I do, because in Haiti, it is the single worst situation. Haiti's not in the situation it is because of lack of food, water, health care, what people talk about the most. It's because of problem in rule of law. So I believe in rule of law. So I applaud the courts for sticking to the Fourth Amendment in the Constitution and the right to, and I believe in privacy a lot. However, this lawyer has actually suggested that the families of the men who are soliciting prostitution are better off if they had never known that a person in their family is using a prostitute, which means that that man, in this case all men, can come home and transmit that sexual disease into his partner, spouse, friend, right? And that's what's wrong with prostitution. And so I just ask people to read this article. It's almost 2,000 words long.
We'll add a hyperlink into our article
and
off
read
this.
that last paragraph and think about how obtuse and absurd this lawyer is being when he says justice has been served, but it should have been served quicker because it's terrible that these women found out that these men were going to prostitutes. And that just really upset their families, and the city should be just excoriated for that. No, I think that the fact that this reporter did not interview one woman related to one man arrested means he has no sensitivity to what prostitution does to the family. Thank you for the time. I'll be back next week if you want me, every week thereafter. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Deacon. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. A wild interview with Deacon Moynihan. Very insightful, both on the issues related to Bob Kraft, as well as some of the implications of a gig economy and contractor-based structure with Uber. I want to thank everybody for tuning on. Kate Nagel will be back tomorrow. It is a Rock'em Sock'em day. There's a big announcement in the morning at the airport on a new international flight. And then back in the afternoon, I know Jennifer Lawless, professor from the University of Virginia, will be on talking about everything that's going on in the presidential election. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in.